Good evening, good evening. Welcome, welcome. This is TransParents, and we are here again. Jenny may or may not make it this evening, so I'm not going to obviously introduce her as normal. My name is Amber. My pronouns are she, her. You can find me at TikTok as long as TikTok continues at Moonchild77. And our special guest tonight is Dr. Diana Sorrentino, and she has been here before, and we are honored to have her back again. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself, Dr. Diana.
Well, let me begin, Amber, by saying how much I appreciate the invitation to spend some quality time with you and your audience. It is truly an honor and a privilege to be part of the work that you do. I'm Dr. Diana Sorrentino. I am a social psychologist and behavioral analyst. My pronouns are she, her. My work is predominantly with the gender diverse and transgender community, adults primarily, and the parents of adolescents or prepubescent children. And I am proud to share that I am a nationally recognized expert on the subject matter of gender diversity and transgender identities. And tonight, as Amber has announced the program, we're going to talk a little bit about the cash review, and we'll just take it from there because this is going to be a very informative, somewhat technical, but hopefully for all of you joining us this evening, it's going to be enlightening. Take it away, Amber.
I think one of the first things that if our audience is coming to this, that they know about the cast review is that was conducted, the NHS is something they kind of wanted this information done on gender affirming care on youth and whether or not it was necessary, whether what was done, where was the evidence for it? Like supposedly there wasn't evidence for it, and they wanted to make sure that they were doing what was in best interest of children for their healthcare needs. So they put out this review, or actually had this Hillary Cass, who's a
Yeah.
pediatrician, come in and do this independent review. And it took over the course of like 4 years. But the recommendations, the final review that she put out, pretty much caused the UK to ban all puberty blockers for anyone under the age of 18. Gender affirming care. And it's for gender affirming care for trans or non-binary, so for your gender diverse population. It's not for other adolescents and prepubescents who are under the age of that or under the age of 18. It's only for the trans community or for the gender affirming care. Let me see, Bernetta. Good to have you here. Thank you for being here this evening. Uruguay. Welcome. And yeah, like I think my first question for you is, so I know that when this came out, it came out, then there was like the Yale study that came back as kind of like evidence-based to push back on it. So I guess the first thing I wanted to break down is, and then also Jenny put in here, I'm in the car riding home. I'm on 10%, so glad to see you, Dr. Ian Amber. Okay, so she's going to try and join us when she gets back to the house. And Jeffrey is here as well. So I think the first thing that we should start with is understanding what type of studies are done, in these cases, when we're talking about anybody who's under the age of 18, and also what we consider standard.
Okay. Let me start with a perspective that I believe everyone can relate to before we dive into clinical studies and scientific research. I'm working on my third book. Let's talk a little bit about neurobiology and physiology of incongruent gender identities and sexual orientation, which is my second book. Within that book, I have an entire, excuse me, appendix of citations and reference. All the research which I have compiled to draw upon to write the book. If I did not include all of that, my book would be classified as hearsay.
Right.
Having all of the citations and the reference material, anyone can read the book and then review the citations, access the citations, which were all peer reviewed by professionals to provide credence and credibility to my work. And this is key in any research study, especially scientific research. You have to have your processes transparent so that any other professional, whether it's a peer review or someone who wants to verify your work, can follow the same protocols and develop the same end result.
Right.
Transparency is key. And when you're having peer reviews or someone to look at the work you're doing, they have to be knowledgeable in the area of expertise. They have to be unbiased. They cannot have any affiliation with myself or whoever is generating the original report, study, or research to give credibility to it. When that is
Right.
lacking, when there's little to no transparency as to what's going on behind the scenes, when an individual like Hillary Cass is engaged by the National Health Service to compile this report, she's a pediatrician with no long term extensive experience in working with gender diverse or transgender individuals at any age. And the majority of individuals who were identified that worked with her on the review had no experience, no clinical training. And their excuse for doing this was, well, the individuals with the knowledge would be biased in favor of it. Well, I'm sorry, but professionals in the field do not allow their biases to interfere.
Right.
However, let's just say the biases did interfere. If the research and all the material that they used to compile their study was available and could be verified by someone else or multiple other people, there would be no bias because they would be able to see that it was based on fact and proper protocols in science and research. And to say that this is experimental, as indicated in the Cass review, is throwing away over 70 years of research and clinical practice dating back to before Christine Jorgensen even
Right.
had her gender affirmation in the 50s. All the work that was done, I'm having a senior moment, so bear with me. Excuse me. Oh, I hate when I have those, but it gives my age. Ah, excuse me. This is annoying me. Ah,
Hmm.
Harry Benjamin, Dr. Harry Benjamin. He is the father of research for gender affirming care, going back to
Right.
Magnus Hirschfeld and all the ones that he worked and studied with and under. There are so many flaws in the Cass review and the overview, the critique conducted by Yale drives this point home very clearly. And for those of you who choose to download the report from Yale, Amber's made it available. The very first page lists all of the professionals, the physicians, the researchers, the lawyers, and institutes that were involved in the critique. Just a couple of important points right from the Yale report. Unfortunately, the review repeatedly misuses data and violates its own evidentiary standards by resting many conclusions on speculation. Many of its statements and the conduct of York SRs reveal profound misunderstandings of the evidence base and the clinical issues at hand. The review also subverts widely accepted processes for the development of clinical recommendations and repeats spuriously debunked claims about gender identity and gender dysphoria. These errors conflict with well-established norms of clinical research, evidence-based healthcare. Further, these errors raise serious concern about the scientific integrity of critical elements of the report's processes and recommendations. I mean, that's damning in itself. Gets better. Most of the review's known contributors have neither research nor clinical experience in transgender healthcare. The review incorrectly assumes that clinicians who provide and conduct research in transgender healthcare are biased. Expertise is not considered biased in any other realm of science or medicine and should not be considered as such here. Further, many of the review's authors' identities are unknown. No transparency. Transparency and trustworthiness go hand in hand, but many of the review's authors cannot be vetted for ideological, intellectual conflicts or interests. 6 points from their executive summary. We're still in the Yale critique. The Cash Review makes statements that are consistent with the models of gender-affirming medical care described by WPATH and the Endocrine Society. The Cash Review does not recommend a ban on gender-affirming medical care. The Cash Review does not follow established standards for evaluating evidence and evidence quality. The Cash Review fails to contextualize the evidence for gender-affirming care with the evidence base for other areas of pediatric medicine. The Cash Review misinterprets and misrepresents its own data. The Cash Review levies unsupported assertions about gender identity, gender dysphoria, standard practices, and the safety of gender-affirming medical treatments, and repeats claims that have been disproved by sound evidence. 6. The systematic reviews relied upon by the Cash Review have serious methodological flaws, including the omission of key findings to the extent of body of literature. The review's relationship with and the use of York's systematic reviews violates standard processes that lead to clinical recommendations in evidence-based medicine. If you read the Cash report and you digest these 40-plus pages, it doesn't take long for you to be able to read between the lines that the National Health Service, which is socialized medicine in the United Kingdom, wanted a means by which they could shut down any and all gender-affirming care. I mean, to prevent puberty blockers for those entering Tanner stage 2 and saying that puberty blockers can be administered at the age of 18 rather than 10 or 12 is ludicrous, because at 18, you're out of puberty, your secondary sex characteristics are fully developed. They're not going to do any good.
No.
And like I said,
That's the point, though. I mean,
yeah,
that's the point. That was really the point, and that was the point of, honestly, the review in itself was a way for them to shut down the care and look and say, "Hey, look, this study said that you can't do it." Um, uh, yeah,
now the sad thing, and this is not limited to the issues with the Cash Review, individuals, organizations, politicians, media, and the list goes on, if they have an ideological perspective that they want to pursue, they will find the scraps of information that support their position and use it, even if
right.
it's improperly compiled. When I was part of the Department of Defense in the intelligence community, we ran into this all the time with politicians. The reviews, the clinical analysis, the critical analysis of intelligence would provide a clear picture of what was existing, whether it was in Iraq or any other place in the world. But it did not fit the political agenda of whoever was in power at the time. So they would cherry pick pieces of information out of the report that would support their position to the exclusion of the information that would not support their position. And that's what's happening with the cash review.
Right.
One thing to listen to Amber and myself this evening discuss these points. The cash review is 388 pages. You can download it as a PDF. I wouldn't recommend reading the whole thing. However, read the Yale review, which is broken down by sections that then you can go in and look at the cash review and then take the cash review in its entirety to see what a poorly structured document it is as far as the quality of the content. Now, returning to the books I write, the citation and reference section is enormous. Out of a 675-page book, there's probably 40 to 50 pages of citations. So
I can
that
believe it.
anyone reading the book who questions the content or my opinion in a certain section can go to the citation, find the relevant research, and what's really neat is when you pull up a specific document that I have referenced, that document will also reference a minimum of 20 to 50 additional research documents that they use to create
Right.
their document. This is transparency. This is what gives credibility to a book, a report, scientific study. Now, I want to share something with you. My second book, Neurobiology and Physiology, is going to come in at about 800 pages. It's in the publisher now. This is a 3-inch 3-ring binder. I have 4 of these filled with the research material that I used for that book.
Right.
And each one of these peer-reviewed documents has a listing of anywhere from 25 to 50 additional resources and citations. This is how you do research with full
Right.
transparency.
I was going to say, so, okay, let's talk about WPATH. For their standards, how many studies would you estimate, ballpark, that they used to create their standards of care?
Well, first of all, WPATH is an international organization, and
Right.
they draw on the expertise from around the world. And it's
Right.
not just endocrinologists or physicians or surgeons, it's psychologists, it's counselors, stakeholders from the community, like myself. I am an affirmed woman.
Right.
Digressing for a moment, I transitioned. My life's evolution took place in January of 1990. This is 35 years for me.
Woohoo!
All right, so it's a little anniversary month, January. The CAST review had focus groups, none of which included the parents, families, or individuals who were part of the gender diverse or transgender community. No knowledge, no experience, no resources.
So how can it really be about them if you never actually spoke or got experience, lived experiences from that community? How can you really have a picture of the research?
Yeah.
That's the
One,
question that people really need to dig into. Like that actually is probably a problem that I would say that goes into a lot of clinical studies. When we do research, is that for a very long time it was done on men, white men. And so you were basing women off of men, metabolic rates. You were basing like all these different categories that really should have been looked at one point wasn't. And we're still pushing in the LGBT community for them to have clinical research experience where you've got actual studies that consider their experiences because it's really kind of, I wouldn't say lacking, but it is substantially lacking compared to other populations
okay,
when we
a
look
couple
at who has
studies.
participated.
Yeah. I scanned a page out of one of my research books and I sent it to you. I'm just going to highlight a few pieces for our audience. In 2011, standards of care for the health of transsexual, transgender, and gender nonconforming people, World Professional Association for Transgender Health. That was 2011. In 2022, I was upgraded to the Standards of Care 8. So this is
Right.
ongoing research. 2013, the Royal College of Psychiatrists in London, good practice guidelines for the assessment and treatment of adults with gender dysphoria. 2014, the Pan American Health Organization, blueprint for the provision of comprehensive care for trans persons and their communities in the Caribbean and the countries of Central America. 2015, Health Policy Project, Asia Pacific Transgender Network, United Nations Developmental Program, blueprint for the provision of comprehensive care for trans people and trans communities in Asia and the Pacific Rim. 2016, University of California, San Francisco Center for Excellence of Transgender Healthcare, guidelines for the primary and gender-affirming care of transgender and gender non-binary people. 2017, the Endocrine Society of the United States, endocrine treatment, gender dysphoric, gender incongruent persons, and endocrine study clinical practice guidelines. That's just a sample. So how can
Right.
kids or anyone else say there's been no research?
Right. I do agree. I agree completely. Like that was, and I saw like, because to do the research for this episode, like I'd done looked into the cast review, and then I'd found the Yale. Like I already knew about Insight, but like I'd done more digging into the Insight review at Yale, and then I went and looked further because there was backlash to even the Yale review, right? But everybody that came back, every piece of article, every group that came up and said, okay, well, the Yale review was false and they had bias and they used their ideology, was done and backed by a right wing propaganda group, whether you were talking about the US or the UK. And it was that like they were the ones saying that it was, oh no, that's not, well, where's the transparency? Where's the evidence to back up your statement? And they don't have any. So it's again that misinformation. But I think again people don't necessarily understand because I did try to we talk about standards of care to change a standard of care from what the current rate is. We have to be able to say, hey, look, here's all of these studies that say the exact same thing and how this will improve the current standard. And you have to be able to prove that before we ever implement it on the floor and go in and change all the protocols and the textbooks and the education within the departments for the people that are coming up to go to the floor. And I don't think people really think about that to create standards of care, there's been a ton of research that says that's okay for us to put it into place. So one little study, and like the CAS review, for example, she reviewed 11 reviews, 11 studies. 11? 11. That's all you reviewed was 11 studies to come up with your results. Like just that number, I was like, that's not even research. My thesis for my bachelor's degree, it was 40 pages long, and I think there were 9 pages of resources, of citations. Again, because you have to have your evidence in place. That's what solidifies your statement when you're creating research. When you're trying to improve anything or make a statement, you have to be able to back it up. And not just back it up, you have to back up what you backed up.
Precisely. I was in a diner recently having a conversation with a friend of mine I was having lunch with on this subject. And an individual who was in a nearby booth overheard the conversation and made a very derogatory comment about trans care. So I took a deep breath and I turned to the gentleman and said, that's an interesting perspective. Would you care to share your research sources? Crickets. I
And
said,
see,
if you would like.
that's the thing is people want to say, because, and the reason why when Jenny and I talked about it, and I was just like, I'm reviewing the legislation last week on the show. Part of what I uncovered was that we had a lot of, even in the US, our politicians are using this year, or this past year, 2024, they were using the CAS review to back up the reasons why we should create these anti-trans legislation for gender affirming care for the youth population. And it was just kind of like, okay, so you're using a review that's not even from here. You're not even listening to any of the standards of care that are in the US that are already established from every single medical organization, major medical organization we have here. You're listening to some report over there, which again just kind of told you this has bias. There's a reason why they've backed it up in the way that they backed it up.
Yeah. There's a family and a young lady who I've worked with now for probably almost 15 years. She's turning 21, assigned male at birth, started puberty blockers at age 11, started her cross-sex hormones, feminizing hormones, at 14, had her vaginoplasty surgery at 16. This young lady is drop dead gorgeous, honor roll, Dean's List student in her 4-year college, where she's entering her 4th year, I think now. So many who are properly evaluated, and the protocols and the procedures exist for proper evaluations. And what the politicians and so many others missed the mark, puberty blockers, gonadotropin releasing hormone agonists, is a pause button. It's reversible, and it does not stop, or what it doesn't stop all the dysphoria, but it gives the individual entering Tanner stage 2, which is the onset of the physical changes of puberty, time to consider further their options and whether further gender affirming treatment would be appropriate. And there are occasions, but few, where the individual will change their mind and want to remain in their assignment at birth, male or female. Puberty blockers are discontinued and puberty kicks in immediately. Now, they'll raise concerns about, oh, the person's health, their bone development. Well, again, let's hit the pause button. Before the administration of puberty blockers, a complete physical is conducted, comprehensive metabolic blood profiles, bone mineralization studies to determine the health of the individual right down to the bone level at that point. If they're cleared, they can commence with the puberty blockers. If there are any issues with bone mineralization, with their metabolic blood profiles, those have to be brought under control and stabilized before the administration of any medication is concerned. I mean, as I shared a little while ago, my gender affirmation, social and legal, took place in January of 1990. I have been on feminizing hormones since 1986. Before my endocrinologist would allow me to begin, I had to have a complete physical, metabolic blood profile. I had lost quite a bit of weight in preparation for this. He felt a mass on my liver and wanted to make sure that it was just residual fat, so ultrasound, and it was a little residual fat. Liver has to be tested for functioning. I mean, you don't just walk in and say, hey, I want to start affirming my gender female or male, and they hand out hormones. It's not the way it
Right.
works. Now, tomorrow, I am doing a program for the League of Women Voters on gender diversity and transgender identities. They contacted me last fall to do the program.
Awesome.
And I can tell you from experience, because I do quite a few of these, several a month. When I'm done, it's like, we had no idea. Well, of course, you're not going to have any idea. This is not in the mainstream, credible information. You're not dealing with it. You do not know people who are gender diverse or transgender. You're not doing independent research. How would you know?
Right.
And I provide
I
them
think
with,
it's also hard with all the disinformation that's out there, like the
well,
layers and layers and layers of that if that's all they have heard, I think it's very difficult to digest when they do hear the truth because it's kind of like, well, that's the first time I'm hearing that if they don't know someone. So I do
well,
think there is something to be said for those who don't know and haven't had that experience. But that's kind of the reason why we wanted to do the show was so that we
yeah.
could kind of help
And what's also
debunk that.
very important is gender dysphoria, gender diversity, transgender identities are not a 20th or 21st century phenomenon. Been part of cultures and civilizations for thousands of years. Ancient rabbinical texts even reference 7 different genders. You have civilizations and societies around the world that today have 3, 4, 5 different recognized gender classifications. This is
Right.
nothing new. It's just that the media and the politicians decided that it was something worth expanding
Making noise
upon.
about.
Yeah, and you
I mean,
know,
if they can distract us about this issue, right? Then they can do A, B, C, D while you're not paying any attention. And then when you go,
you're reading my you're
why are
reading
we
my mind,
paying this
Amber.
much?
Yeah,
Right?
it's like, why are you making so much noise about something that's so insignificant? Leave it to the medical providers, leave it to the families, leave it
Right.
to the individuals. What are you trying to distract us from?
Right.
Why is this
Right.
such an issue? It's not a political issue. But the cash review and the fact that it was commissioned by the National Health Service, again, this is socialized medicine over there. They
Right.
control what you're eligible for in any category, not just gender affirming care.
Mm. I think that's probably just the worst thing that they came out with because I've even heard that Hillary Cass herself has kind of admitted now that okay, no, that I didn't really probably follow the best of standards.
She
And
did.
it's kind of like then how can and at the same time though, and then NHS still went ahead and used this to take away gender affirming care,
Yeah, because that was their goal from the get go.
right? I mean, that's what
They,
our politicians are using here now as evidence for why we should.
and again, the sad thing is, this is nothing new.
No,
When an individual, a politician, a focus group, a right wing, left wing, middle group, whatever, they have an ideology that they want to support, they'll commission a study that is designed to support their position.
right,
But again, it gets back to the cash report. No transparency. The individuals involved were not credible researchers. They discounted or ignored all the relevant history going back a minimum of 75 years, and it
right.
predates the 50s. This is nothing experimental.
It's just
Oh,
more agenda,
yeah.
unfortunately.
Feminizing hormones are harmful. If they were harmful, I'd be dead already. However, it's like with any medication. Let's not even talk about gender affirming care. You need to be monitored. It has to be administered by a professional. Like I mentioned, my doctor put me through a battery of tests. It took several months before I received my first prescription. Then I had to visit him quarterly for 3 years for metabolic blood profiles to make certain that everything was staying stable. Once I reached the right level of hormones in my system and all the metabolic blood profiles, the triglycerides, the lipids were all within normal limits, it went to every 6 months. And to this day, even though I have a new primary care physician managing my meds, I see her every 6 months. I have an appointment coming up the end of this month. Metabolic blood profile. I go to the lab, the vampire strikes, and I get the results.
Once again, we
And
were
what's
talking about that right before
interesting,
the show. You were talking about your latest blood work. So I mean,
yeah,
it's something that's an ongoing, and I think that there is this nuance that people just a kid just comes in off the street and says, "Hey, I want to change my gender. Can you like give me some meds?" And they go on them, and it's instant. And it is never like that. Ever.
no,
Ever. The surgeries aren't like that. My son has been waiting for, I think by the time he gets his consult for the top, he will have waited at least 6 or 7 months, at least, just to do the consultation.
no,
It is not a quick process. And then I can tell you it is not going to be quick from the consult to the surgery. Could be like if it was my surgery was 6 months out. So I have my abdominal surgery I had this past summer, and so or well last summer now, and so I could see how that could potentially still be like summer or fall for him before he actually
yeah.
has surgery. So
Another very important point is we have yet to touch on this tonight, but we need to, is we always have to make a clear differentiation between prepubescent children and adolescents. Prepubescent children, those who are still in Tanner stage 1, are not eligible for any medical, hormonal, surgical intervention, period. Even if that prepubescent child from the age of 3 is insistent, persistent, and consistent that their gender is different than their sex assignment at birth, nothing happens until Tanner stage 2 puberty. There are occasions where a social transition can take place for the prepubescent child within the family to see how things go. But it's only with the onset of Tanner stage 2 before the full impact of puberty and secondary sex characteristics kick in will intervention be allowed. And even then, the individual has to be screened, have to have the medical work done. It's not just walk in to your neighborhood Rite Aid and say, hey, I want X amount of estradiol or I want the X amount of testosterone. It does not work that way. The politicians love
it's
these.
usually with a team too, right? It's not just one
It's,
doctor. Like it's usually
it's,
several different doctors being
it's
brought in together,
interdisciplinary. You have the primary care physician, and even though we're talking prepubescent adolescents, until they hit 18, they see a pediatrician. They don't see a regular doctor.
right?
You have psychologists. You have the endocrinologist. And then when the time comes, you have the consulting surgeon who will perform whatever surgery is going to be appropriate. Now, what the politicians and the media and the naysayers love to do and say, oh, you're butchering minors. That's why I am insistent on using prepubescent children and adolescents, because a 16-year-old is a minor, an 8-year-old is a minor. A 16-year-old is a child, an 8-year-old is a child. So we need to be clear. Tanner stage 2, the onset of puberty, is when any intervention would be eligible for an individual. After evaluation by a psychologist, medical examinations by their pediatrician, and a review and approval and maintenance by an endocrinologist who specializes in this type of care. The endocrinologist that I used for 30 years, 2/3 of his practice was with the community. And he
Right.
joined the practice with his father-in-law, Dr. Futterwhite, who had been working with the community for 30 years prior. So Futterwhite had been working with us since the 50s.
Goodness.
Again, the history is there. The clinical
Right.
studies are there. The research is there if they want to use it. That's the key.
Right.
If they want to use it. They do not want to use it because it does not fit their agenda, their political ideology. And it's like, what are you trying to accomplish here? You're not helping children.
No.
You're hurting them. The
I think I
suicidal
saw in
ideation.
I think I saw in cases or Cass's review at one point that she made the comment that there wasn't enough clinical studies on the prepubescent for gender affirming care and the use of puberty blockers. And I was like, because they're not in puberty. They don't need to be on them. Like, that's the reason why you can't find the data. And we're not giving them to that classification. Like, when we talk about those two different stages, the prepubescent, they're not getting it in the first place. That's the reason why there
However,
aren't studies to talk about it.
however, since the 60s, puberty blockers have been using for precocious puberty in 7, 8, and 9-year olds.
I wasn't that young, but I took it because of mine. And then mine, I think I started maybe at 11, and that would have
Well, for,
been the 80s, the late 80s.
yeah. Well, for females, puberty usually kicks in between 10 and 12, males 12 to 14.
Right,
So you may have been a little ahead of the curve, so they wanted to pause it by a year or two. But there's some that 7, 8, 9 years old. Girls are going into counter stage 2, and it's like, whoa, time out. They're not ready for
right,
this. And that's where the puberty blockers come in. But for Cass to say there's no research on prepubescence, well, they're not being treated,
right.
right? They're being monitored. Okay.
And I think then politicians and your media, right, that bias group, they then use that because if you don't realize what they're doing, if you don't know research enough to understand that, then it's really easy to dupe your populations that you're speaking to.
And again, to be overly redundant, this is why I stress the point in every single program I do, whether it's for civilians or for medical or behavioral health professionals. We have to delineate prepubescent children from
Right,
adolescents, and that line of demarcation is Tanner stage 2 puberty. Prior to that, in Tanner stage 1, no intervention. Now, if there are behavioral issues with the child, the prepubescent child, yeah, they could see a psychologist for that. A
right.
psychologist who's trained in early childhood development, but no medical intervention.
Nope. Yeah,
I
I
read
think
through
it's
the whole I read through the whole
it,
CAS report, and I'll tell you, I didn't want to take my blood pressure afterwards because I think I would have spiked.
probably, probably. No, I couldn't. I couldn't because like I had seen enough, and I think I did read the report, the like final report, I think, which was a shorter version. It wasn't the full review. So I
Yeah,
had read that
the
piece of her
executive summary.
research already, right?
Yeah.
And I had already read that piece, and then did the Yale one, and I was just like, yeah, that's enough. That's it was enough for me to see, okay, I know what because going to nursing school, two different nursing school for a bachelor's is all about your evidence-based medicine. Everything is about evidence-based. And so with whatever paper you're writing, everything has got to be thoroughly researched and you have to have peer-reviewed evidence because they don't want you to just put in your opinion. It is supposed to be based on something that has been proven by somebody else and established for a reason. And
Oh,
so for me, I could read through those two, the shorter pieces, and go, it's really easy to see where y'all kind of cherry picked, where the cast review had cherry picked the data points that they wanted to use, and then left out where, well, you came up with this stat. Well, where was the data to prove that stat? And that would have conveniently been left out. Well, you can't,
With my
how did you prove it? There was no transparency there.
Whether it's with the books I've written, the articles, and in the material that I have published, as I mentioned earlier, I always list in painful detail the citations and reference. Now, I have been working with the community as a professional for 35 years, ever since my own gender affirmation. I have a boatload of experience where I could write and write and write without citing a single citation or reference, and it would be
Right,
credible. But that's not what I do. But within my writings and even in my books, I'll have an opinion page based on my experience. And because, like with transgender families, there's quite a bit of information in there. Well, I'll include personal note. This is what I went through. This is what I am taking. This is what I have experienced. But again, the citations are there to support the data, the
right,
facts. And like the binder I showed you, I have 4 of those for my second book. And each peer reviewed article that's in there has 25 to 50 supplemental citations for that article that I used. And many of them I also looked at, not necessarily to verify what the primary was giving me, but to dig deeper into the material. This is what research is. And writing
right,
a book is research, unless you're writing, fiction.
right. And then that's what delineates it from research.
Yeah.
Is that
And to, and to
there's no
be very
evidence for it.
critical, we could say the cash report is fiction.
Right, right. Yeah, and that's kind of like Jenny and I was reading out the reports last week, like kind of some of the reviews from the anti-trans legislation from last year for 2024. And what you started to see the further and further we went out through the year was the more and more the CAS review was being referenced in these different state legislations for anti-trans legislation for children, or well, for your youth, whether it be you're talking about sports, whether it be you talk about letting them go to their bathroom of choice at school, like they were using everything they possibly could and attaching it to the cast review, and it was just like that's not even our, like I don't mean to be ugly, but that's not even our country, guys. Like we have standards in America, and you're completely choosing to ignore what the standards are to go off this one little independent review that honestly has been debunked by science here. And it's infuriating. It's infuriating because we've already seen what started off last week. I don't know where the number is, but I think last week we said that the number was around 168 between the rollover bills and the bills that are already waiting to get started for the next term. So we're not quite double what we were last year going into the beginning of the year, but that they're again pushing the anti-trans legislation. And we're probably going to see the cast review mentioned more often, which is why
What's,
Jenny and I was like, we just need to do a whole episode on it. I was like, let me call Dr. Diana. We
well,
just need
what's also
to crack this
interesting
open.
is in many of the cases, the individual that the anti-trans groups would bring in to testify, when asked to name the puberty blocker being used, didn't know that it was gonadotropin releasing hormone agonist. Okay? And what's interesting is gonadotropin releasing hormone is the hormone that triggers puberty. The agonist suffix is the extra compound to block that temporarily. You have people testifying that don't even know what these things are. I mean,
Which
it's
again just
insanity.
proves that it just proves that it's for a certain agenda. It's not for kids. It's not to support healthcare whatsoever, no matter what the population
Yeah,
group is.
yeah. I want to know, what
And
is the
it's just used to
agenda?
debunk it.
What is the agenda?
to block healthcare.
Yeah,
Honestly, to to discriminate against the whole population.
yeah.
I don't want to be the one that calls that one out, but that truthfully is what we're seeing here in the US. That's what the next
Well, now
set
for
is
the
going to
average
try and keep
person,
pushing.
yeah, the average person is going to say, "Well, this really doesn't affect me yet,"
Yet.
because if they're successful in this realm, what's going to stop them
Nothing.
from moving further?
Nothing. It I try not to live in fear, right? So I don't really think that far ahead, because just because I know that somebody is screaming it and typing it on social media as much as they want doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's going to be passed and put into law. So I try to stay in that present mindset, right? We're prepared for what comes, but at the same time, let's not freak out and panic because the world is not, the sky's not falling. We know that that is what some people, they want to, I hate to be that one. They want to scare. They want to scare the populace. They want to scare, and they honestly want to scare the LGBT community back into the closet. They prefer it didn't exist.
Well, what we're going through today with gender diversity and transgender identities is actually worse than what the gay and lesbians went through in the 60s and 70s when they were under full assault.
I wasn't around for that one, but I do remember it again in like the early, I guess you'd say the 90s and the early 2000s, that there was again this like pickup for gay rights, whether it be marriage or adoption, you name it. And again, because honestly, I'll own at that point in time, I was on the wrong side of the fence. Um, and I was very homophobic and very transphobic. And I can just tell you that this is like repeating that cycle. Like it's more polarized now than it was then, but it's like just watching them go by the same playbook again.
Yeah. I was on a panel recently, and part of the panel was anti gay, anti trans, anti the entire community, arguing against all these gay rights bills. So when it was my turn, I turned to the individual and said, I have a question for you. Would you kindly show me where in the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights that our rights are restricted?
That's exactly it.
I said, they're not.
That's exactly it. That's what ticks me off because I'm looking at my kid thinking, you're not taking that from my kid.
Yeah.
And for anyone's child or anyone. And I think, and it is obviously an agenda. There's a ton of misinformation. And I think this year I'm trying to move out of the anger of it and more into that I'm still fighting, but it's more of that peaceful. It's not even peaceful. It's just I'm not going to let you rattle me. I'm just not. I'm not. I got better things to do. And if you want to rant about it, then go rant over there. I have work to do over here because that's nonsense, and I know what is fact. And my
Well,
kid, along with anybody else who's out there who's transgender, who's non-binary, no matter how you feel, you have that right to feel that way. And nobody has the right to take that away. Yeah, I'm trying not to get too, because I'll get angry on it. But and I'll try to
listen,
stay out
I
of
can
that.
relate. Listen, I can
Right?
relate.
I'm
I can
sure.
relate. Now, our listeners, those who've joined us this evening, do you have any questions? It's great when you have questions or comments that we can expand upon.
I really haven't seen that many, and it could be. I can't refresh the page here, StreamYard, if I do, it kicks us out. And sometimes I feel like it's like during the middle of the show, if people haven't commented in a while, it's almost like LinkedIn. It it doesn't not sync up anymore, but it's like you aren't getting. I don't get questions anymore from LinkedIn coming in. It's like I'll go to the event afterward, and there'll be a bunch of them, and I'll be like, I didn't see any of these in StreamYard, but I'm not seeing any more since early on, which is okay.
Yeah.
I told Jenny, like I knew this was going to be a very informative, and that was what I wanted. I wanted one that was more informative, that really just kind of spoke to
Yeah. One of
the
the things
cast
that,
review in
yeah,
general.
right, I'd like to impress upon anyone listening, do your own research. The material is available. It takes effort. I mean, if you want to have an opinion or take a position, do it from a factual standpoint. It's like periodically when I run into somebody who gets on their high horse about the necessity of anti-trans legislation, I'll ask them, that's fascinating. I'd be interested to look at your research. Crickets. And it goes, I love to use this example because it really drives the point home. A few years ago, I did a program for my church on gender diversity and transgender identities. And one of the older ladies with white hair out to here, I'm 5 minutes into my presentation, she slams her fist on the table and says, if it has a penis, it's a boy, period. I took a deep breath, collected my thoughts, and I looked at her and said, not always. 2 hours later, I had no idea. 2 weeks later, because she's a member of my church, she came up to tell me how much she learned. She had no idea. And then brag about her lesbian daughter who lives in Texas. And she has now invited me to speak at another organization that she's involved with on this subject. Someone from that same program that I did more recently invited me to speak to the League of Women Voters here in Pennsylvania. That's tomorrow.
And that's awesome. I mean, those are those tiny little ripples that I feel like conversation, like having talks that puts out, right? That here was someone within your community, within your church community, who had an opinion and felt one way, and then once they really had a chance to listen to you, change their mind. And then not only that, they then opened up probably not only just to you, but probably opened up to their child who now they were telling you about. That may have opened a door to a relationship that could have been honestly on the back burner.
One of the chambers of commerce that I was involved with years ago would tell us for every person you meet, you have the potential to connect with upwards of 100 to 200 other people based on their network. So when you can inform intelligently one person, you have no idea what that ripple is going to be and how long it's going to carry.
Right.
Now, I had shared with you transgender families is doing phenomenal. I mean, it's up and down on the scale in Amazon because they keep running out of books. At one point, I came within 10 points of being in the top 100 of the books on medical psychology on Amazon.
Nice. Nice.
Well, that book was 100,000 words. Book two, which is neurobiology and physiology of incongruent gender identities and sexual orientations, has come in at 168,000 words.
Woo.
Book three, which I'm still working on the manuscript, is currently at 214,000 words and growing.
You had to put that one out. I think that one needs to be in volumes, Dr. Diana. Like we need to put that one out, maybe volume 1 and 2, or 1, 2, and 3.
Well, the thing
Um,
is, book one was specifically written for parents and families of gender diverse and transgender individuals.
right.
It's a little lighter because I didn't want to overwhelm the readers. Now, all the citations are in there, all the websites, all the recommended reading. So they can go well beyond transgender families if they so choose.
Right.
Book 2 and book 3 are textbooks. While the average person would benefit from reading them, book 2 specifically is for the medical and behavioral healthcare community. The chief physician in the emergency department, I was there before Christmas. I sent her a copy complimentary of Transgender Families. And when I was sharing with her while I was still in a hospital gown about book 2, she says, I want a copy of that one. So, of course, I'm going to make sure she gets one when it's released.
Right.
When I saw my cardiologist, I sent her a book because when she learned, she was a new cardiologist for me, and when she learned what it was that I did, she says, how many cards do you have with you? She says, I have patients that need this.
Right.
There's a hunger for credible information. And again, to be overly redundant, aside from what I write, all the supporting data points, all the supporting research, the citations, the peer review studies are available in full transparency. If somebody wants to critique my book, go for it.
Oh, yeah, I wouldn't even try. That's a lot of data to go through. I would not. And if they do, then yeah, I'm interested to see uh, what type of data they use to critique with, right, to back up their review. Um, I think you'll find that it's more opinion than it is fact.
Oh,
And that's par for the course. That's kind of, and that was the reason why Jenny and I feel like we need to talk about this
well,
as a
our
whole
job,
episode.
our job as professionals, and in your work and Jenny's work, is to inchworm, a little at a time, bring out the credible information. I'm educating civilians. I'm doing programs for medical and behavioral healthcare professionals. Here I am in a hospital gown in the emergency department due to supraventricular tachycardia, and the physician who I just referenced comes back to me 2 hours later to tell me I have an invitation to speak at Grand Rounds in July
Wow.
because they want the information.
Yep.
One of my psychologist colleagues says, only you would be hustling in the emergency department. So fortunately, it ended up being a non-event, and I'm healthy, all's fine, but not where I wanted to be the week before Christmas, 2 days in the
Right.
coronary unit.
No. I can imagine. Like I said before the show, my mother had some issues too right around the holidays, and it was just like, we this is not the we no, this is not the time to be having
Right,
those conversations. But back to
right.
you talking to this professional, I think every conversation can
Now,
be a teachable
here's
moment.
here's here's the kicker. I'm in my room in the progressive coronary unit. It's not ICU.
Hmm.
It's not a regular unit. It's focus care. I'm walking around with a monitor. My room was like a revolving door of physicians coming in to talk to me, not about why I was in the hospital, but about the work I do, my books,
Right.
the research. Because in my hospital records, transgender person, male to female. So it's no secret.
Right.
It was a revolving door of physicians and nurses coming in wanting to talk to me, not just about my background, but about questions they had about gender affirming care.
And it's because it's not being like there's not enough of it being taught within the programs themselves. So then when you have
Well,
these physicians, these clinicians, nurses, whatever the staff are coming out of school, they are really kind of coming in with just not a whole lot of experience with that
well,
particular community.
well, this is under what you just said is underscored by a study that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2011. A survey of 132 medical schools in the United States addressing transgender, LGBTQ issues, 16 specific topics. Of the 132 schools, only 8% covered all 16 topics in their academic and clinical studies, and most of them only contributed 5 hours of study, clinical or academic, to the subjects.
Right.
I met a general practitioner, family doctor, at a networking event, and he goes, "Oh yeah, I work with transgender people." "Really? Are you a member of WPATH?" "What's WPATH?" I said, "What training have you received?" "Well, I had some in my clinical." I looked him square in the eye and said, "You have no idea what you're doing." And I was very colorful with my metaphors. He never showed up again. And I was like, these are the individuals who create problems.
Right.
There are psychologists out there who are working with individuals who've had no training, and they're being weeded out. They're the ones who create problems.
Right.
The research is solid. The history is solid. The criteria for care is solid. That's why, Harry Benjamin, it was originally, WPATH was originally the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, and it became WPATH because it's global.
Right.
And it's clinical based research and science from all members of the community, medically, psychologically, stakeholders, research, and the like. It's evidence based healthcare.
And that's what it is healthcare.
Yes.
We're not just talking about a trend, right? This is truly healthcare. And I think that gets really muddled when they want to say that this is a trend kind of thing going on, and they play it off like it is, but what you're not really owning is that you're talking about playing with people's healthcare. And more
And what
often than
they're
not, in these cases, you're talking about prepubescent and really adolescent healthcare.
and what they're not talking about is when an individual is not afforded the requisite care for their gender dysphoria or gender incongruence. The suicidal ideation rate for adolescents is 70%.
Right.
The attempted suicide rate is 40%. When provided with appropriate care, medically and psychologically, their suicidal ideation rate is below the norm for their cisgender peers.
Right.
But they don't want to talk about that.
No.
I work with adults, 30 plus, who are emerging, breaking through years of repression and suppression and denial. The suicidal ideation rate with them is high also because many of them are married, they have families, and they've been burying their incongruent identity for decades. And then it
Right.
finally reaches a point where they cannot do it anymore. And that's when my phone rings. It's usually a referral from a family physician or another psychologist, to help them sort through their experiences, to understand. I mean, what I
I mean,
went through it.
we were finally kind of making progress so that we didn't continue seeing this population that had to wait, right,
Yeah.
to emerge later in life. They could go ahead and start that journey earlier. And I talk about it a lot, like, supportive when we support children, our kids at home through that journey, they grow up into full adults. But if they're traumatized because they weren't supported, then what you have are traumatized adults.
Cedar Sinai, Kaiser Permanente, each have done studies on adverse childhood experiences beginning in prepubescence, carrying through and into adolescence, and the damage, the psychological damage, the emotional damage, the physical health damage that they have endured because of the adverse childhood experiences lasts a lifetime.
Right.
Cedars-Sinai, Kaiser Permanente. You can find these studies are out there. You just have to want to find them.
And that gets to the heart of it, right? What is your intention when you're going to look for your research? Are you looking for research to back your opinion? Are you truly digging for the truth? How far are you
Well, let's
willing to
get
look?
back to my second and third books. They're textbooks.
Right?
They are designed to educate. And in order to educate, while I will include opinions, which will be identified as professional opinions based on my 35 years of experience working with the community, I have the clinical studies, the peer review studies, the scientific studies, the citations to research to back up everything in those books.
Right.
It's not just me sitting down and writing from memory my experiences for 35 years. While that's valuable, it does not create a textbook.
Right. Agreed. Agreed. Well, we have run over time once again, and if anybody is here and we didn't see your questions, I will try to get to them and answer them and pass them along to Dr. Diana if you have questions for her, in case we didn't see them here. But I want to thank y'all for joining us this evening. We will be back next week. I'm not entirely sure. I checked to verify our guests next week because we're pre-recording it during the week this week. But they are currently on vacation, so they can't confirm with me until tomorrow. So I can't let anybody know tonight what's going on this or next week, which is fine. But we will be here. The TikTok community, I'm going to go ahead and tell you because we don't know what's going on. This episode will be up there. Obviously, usually upload the episode the night that we air it. And so that would be on the 19th next week when the ban is due to take place. So I'm not entirely sure that the next episode will be there. But if not, follow me on YouTube. Follow TransParents on YouTube, and that's another place, or Spotify. You can continue to follow us there if TikTok gets taken down.
To our listeners, you can connect with me directly through LinkedIn or my website, paradoxesofgender.com. I'm here to educate with credible knowledge and credible experience.
We appreciate
Thank
it.
you, Amber.
We need more. You're welcome. And thank you. Thank you for coming on and continuing to give us your time and your knowledge, honestly, because you're a wealth of knowledge, which is the reason why Jenny and I always are like, hey, we're doing one on studies. Grab Dr. Diana and see if she's available. So I greatly appreciate you spending time with us this week, and hopefully, well, I'm sure we'll be having you on again soon with the book number 2 when it comes out, so we can talk more about the education of it. With that being said, guys, thank y'all for joining us with TransParents, and we will see you next week.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.